Okay, so hello again. For now, we have the axial skeleton, particularly and the vertebral column. Okay, so actually for the axial skeleton, I have already discussed the skull. So right now we have the three other parts of the axial skeleton, but now for this discussion, we will focus doon sa vertebral column. So kung titingnan natin the vertebral column, actually, this figure, um, this is usually located at the dorsal midline of the body of an animal. And then for the ribs, this usually forms the lateral, no? Lateral na bony structure that usually supporting the thorax. And then we have the last one, the sternum. This is located at the ventral midline of the body of an animal. Okay? So, kung titingnan natin, the vertebral column, this is usually composed of median and paired irregular bones that usually called as vertebrae. So, all throughout the discussion, we will focus with the vertebrae. So we have the cervical, okay, which is being located dito sa neck region. The thoracic, no, which is located dito sa chest region. And then lumbar sa loin area. And then the sacral or sacrum sa, along with the pelvis region. And then we have the coccygeal or caudal, which is on the tail region. Now, we have here one of the popular na topics when it comes to the vertebral columns. We have the vertebral formula. Okay? Pero always take note that for the vertebral formula, it should be in chronological order. Okay? So ano ba yung tawag natin na vertebral formula? So usually ito is a specific arrangement and number ng mga vertebrae in the spinal column of the animal. So every species, each species usually of farm animal, they have a certain characteristic of their vertebral formula that is essential, of course, for understanding their skeletal anatomy and physiology. So ano ba yung usual na purpose ng in terms of the vertebral formula? Bakit kaya natin to inaaral? So una dyan is, of course, that is species identification. Kasi kung titignan ninyo with the table that is being shown right now, magkakaiba yung mga vertebral formulas of the different farm animals natin. So that is number one, species and identification. So this is usually an important tool para ma-identify natin and ma-distinguish natin yung mga different species ng farm animals natin. And pwede, if you could recall your taxonomy, no, yung hierarchy ng taxonomy. So this could be used for the taxonomic classification and differentiation. And then second one is it is for understanding the skeletal structure. So usually itong mga vertebral formulas, it provide insight into the skeletal structure of the farm animals. Kasi kung makikita natin, it usually indicates the number of vertebrae in each region of the spine. So including the cervical, and then we have the thoracic, which is the chest, and then the lumbar, that it's on the lower back or loin region, and then we have the sacral, which is the pelvic, and then we have the caudal, which is the tail region. But then, as what I've said, always take note that for the vertebral formulas, it should be in chronological order. Hindi pwede na, like for example, for the horse, ang mauuna is yung thoracic, yung tapos sacral, and then caudal. It should be always na mauuna si cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral, and then the caudal. So like for an example, for the cattle, this is the ox, this is the cattle. So makikita natin there are 7 for the cervical bones, okay, or cervical vertebrae, and then 13 for the thoracic, and then 6 for the lumbar, 5 for the sacral, and then for the caudal, 18 to 20. Always take note that for the cervical, thoracic, lumbar, and sacral, it's almost na constant. Ang hindi lang constant or merong range is usually etong caudal. Okay? So yun yung i-take note ninyo dito for the vertebral formulas. Ganun lang, kasimple. Like for the example, for horse, there are 7 for cervical, so C7, and then 18 for thoracic, so that it's T18, and then L6, and then S5, and then C15 to 20. Okay, so let's start with the vertebrae. So usually yung vertebrae ng mga farm animals natin, they are being consisted into two main components. We have the vertebral body and then we have the vertebral arc. Okay, so for the vertebral body or what we call as the centrum, usually this is on the anterior. So kaya nasa one, it's on the front. Okay, so it is anterior located and it is a weight-bearing part of the vertebra. So typically, usually mga cylindrical or black-like yung structure nila that usually support the weight of the vertebrae above and yung mga structures above the spine such as yung head tsaka yung body. Okay? So yung mga vertebral bodies, usually they are separated by intervertebral discs, which is usually etong mga intervertebral discs, sila yung nag-a-act as cushions and they usually allow for some degree of flexibility and shock absorption in the spinal column. And then we have the vertebral arc. This is usually located sa posterior naman or rear part of the vertebra, or it usually surrounds the spinal cord. Okay? So makikita natin there are usually key components in terms of the vertebral arc. We have the pedicles. Etong pedicles, usually they are short na projections that extend from the vertebral body and they usually connect to the laminae. Si laminae, flat bone sila or flat plates ng bone that usually extend from the pedicles and they usually meet in the midline. So they usually form the posterior part of the arc. Okay, so the vertebral arc along with the vertebral body encloses usually and protects the spinal cord. Okay? Yun yung palagi ninyong tatandaan when it comes to the vertebral arc. Okay? It usually encloses and protects the spinal cord, forming yung vertebral foramen, which is the spinal canal. Okay? So, etong vertebral arc actually sila or siya yung nagpro-provide ng attachment point for various muscles, ligaments, and then other structures man yan that usually stabilize and support the spine. So, on the average, in terms of the vertebrae, there are 7 processes present in the vertebral arc. And there is a single, one of this one, there is a single spinous process. So ano ba yung mga spinous process? This is actually a single midline projection that usually extends posteriorly from the junction of the laminae. Kasi dito yung part ng laminae. So part siya ng vertebrae that can be felt as the bone ridge along the back of the spine. So they usually project dorsally, so towards the back from the arc of the vertebra, and it serves as important attachment sites for muscles and ligaments. So sa mga horses natin, particularly yung tall spinous processes of the first few na thoracic vertebrae, they usually contribute to the formation of a dorsal prominence which is known as the withers. So ano ba yung mga withers? Etong mga withers naman, they are a prominent ridge located doon sa base ng neck region ng horse between the shoulder blades. So etong area na to, this is very crucial na reference point sa mga various activities ng mga horses natin, including yung saddle fitting and yung pag-determine ng height ng horses natin. Okay? And then another one, we have the transverse processes. So paired projection sila na nag-extend laterally from the junction of the pedicles and laminae. You see, so they usually provide attachment points for muscles and ligaments. So they have usually certain characteristics or certain purposes when it comes to the transverse processes. Una dyan is the muscle attachment. So they are being served as attachment points for the muscles, sa mga tendons, sa mga ligaments. Okay? So yun yung ginagawa nila. In terms of ligament attachment kasi, yung mga ligaments, they usually help stabilizing the spine. Okay? So it also attached to the transverse processes. So these ligaments include yung mga intertransverse ligaments and the capsular ligaments of the facet joints, which now help maintain the alignment and function of the vertebral column. So in terms of articulation, in some vertebrae, especially in the cervical region, etong mga transverse processes, they usually articulate with adjacent vertebrae. So it usually contributes now to the range of motion and flexibility in their neck. So it facilitates etong articulation, it facilitates a movement like yung pag-bend ng neck, yung pag-rotate ng neck. So yun yung ginagawa ng transverse processes. Okay? And then in the vertebral arc of the animals, there are typically 4 articular processes associated with each vertebra. So 2 cranial or superior and then 2 caudal, which is inferior articular processes. So in terms of the cranial or the superior articular processes, they are located on the dorsal na um, side of each vertebra. So it's on the upper side. So etong mga processes na to, they articulate with the corresponding caudal articular processes of the vertebra immediately above them in the vertebral column. So in terms of caudal articular processes, they are located on the ventral side of each vertebrae. So these processes articulate with the corresponding cranial articular processes of the vertebra immediately below them. So yung articulation between caudal and cranial articular processes, they will form the facet joints that facilitate the controlled movement and stability doon sa spine. Okay? Then another one, we have the vertebral foramen. So central opening ito or canal within the vertebra that usually houses and protects the spinal cord as it passes through the vertebral column. So yun lang yung ginagawa niya to in terms of the vertebral foramen. It provide a protective passageway for the spinal cord. And we all know naman that the spinal cord, that is a vital part of the central nervous system, and it usually, as what I've said, it usually carries yung mga sensory and motor na information between the brain and the rest of the body. So yung vertebral foramens, bony enclosure will help now na i-shield yung spinal cord from any physical damage and injury. Then we have the transverse foramen. This is usually found doon sa cervical or neck region ng certain animals natin. So opening din to or canal that is located on the sides of the cervical vertebrae, typically in the region where the vertebral artery passes through. Okay? So ang pinaka-function naman niya nito is for the provision of a protective passageway for important blood vessels, particularly the vertebral artery. So ano ba tong vertebral artery? It usually runs through etong mga kanal na to as it passes through the cervical vertebrae and its way to supply blood to the brain and spinal cord. Now we have here the cervical vertebrae. They are usually the vertebrae that is being found in the neck region or the cervical region of the vertebral column. So actually they are 7. There are 7 cervical vertebrae, pero we will just focus into 6. We have the different views. Kung makikita ninyo, there are in different views. We have the atlas, which is the C1, okay, cervical 1, or the it is being from the dorsal view. Si axis naman that is on the C2 or the cervical 2, which is on the lateral view. And baka kung nagtataka kayo bakit C6 kaagad. Kasi yung third to fifth na vertebrae, they are almost the same with the 6 vertebrae. Pero yung atlas tsaka axis, we are usually calling this one as atypical kasi they are not the same with appearance with the rest of cervical vertebrae. So we will just focus on these three, the atlas, the C1, the axis, the C2, and then we have the C6, which is on the cranial view. So first one, we have the cervical vertebrae, which is the atlas. So actually yung term na atlas from the bones na ginagamit natin sa anatomy, that is being derived from the Greek mythology. So kung nakikilala ninyo si Atlas na Greek mythology, Atlas was a titan who was famously condemned by by Zeus, kung alam niyo yung story na yon, to carry yung heaven. Okay? So parang kung makikita ninyo dito, si Atlas, it was being punished, no, to carry the heavens on his shoulders as a punishment for his role in the in a certain event, between yung war between the Titans and then the Olympian gods. So the choice of the name na Atlas for the first cervical vertebrae is usually symbolic kasi etong vertebrae na to, it usually supports the weight of the skull and it allows for the nodding motion of the head. So it's as if the vertebra carries the head, much like the mythical Atlas carrying the heavens. So doon na-derive yung pangalan niya na Atlas. Okay? So yung Atlas, at what I've said, this is the first cervical vertebra and it is responsible for supporting the skull's weight and allowing for nodding movement. So unlike other cervical vertebrae, yung atlas, it usually lacks a typical na vertebral body and its spinous process. Instead, meron siyang tinatawag natin na anterior and posterior na arc. Okay? So, although kung makikita natin in other books kasi, yung atlas, it does not have a vertebral body like other vertebrae in the spine. Pero kung makikita natin, there are still books na nagsasabi na meron din. Okay, so this is usually the body of Atlas in a caudal view. And then we have here the wings of Atlas. No, we have the wings of the Atlas, etong pinakabuo na to. And then etong mga maliliit na butas, we have the transverse foramen, and then yung mga mas maliliit pa, we call that one as the lateral vertebral foramen. So yung pinaka-wings ng atlas, it usually refers to the transverse process. So as what I have said kanina, the atlas wala siyang spinous process, but then it usually have a transverse process which extend laterally from the main ring-like structure. So etong mga transverse processes, they usually provide attachment points for various muscles, including those which are responsible for neck movement and stability. Then we have the transverse foramen. Meron siyang pair. Kung makikita ninyo, there is a pair of transverse foramina, or what we call as transverse foramen, one on each side of the vertebral arc. So, ano ba yung usual na function ng mga to? Yung mga transverse foramen, actually they serve as a passageway which the vertebral artery usually pass through. So yung mga vertebral artery, as what I've said, they supplies the blood to the brain and the spinal cord, making the presence of these foramina crucial doon sa cervical region. And then we have the lateral vertebral foramen, or what we call as the foramen transversarium. So Ito naman is usually ang meron sa kanya is meron din siyang vertebral artery. Okay, meron siyang vertebral artery, meron siyang vertebral vein, and yung mga sympathetic nerves which are important for the autonomic nervous system. So pag sinabi natin na autonomic nervous system, actually that is being part of the nervous system that controls the involuntary movement of the animal's body. And then we have the axis, which is the C2. It is also known as the epistropheus. So this is the second cervical vertebra, and it usually follows yung atlas, no? So ang pinaka role naman niya dito is on the neck rotation. So it usually features a unique na cranial projection which is being called as the dens. I will show you later on kung ano yung dens. Ito, which is the dens. Ito siya. The dens or odontoid process. So it usually resembles a tooth. No? Parang tooth siya, and it serves a pivot point for the atlas, allowing for rotational movement. So ano ba yung usual na ginagawa nito? Articulation lang in terms na it allows for rotational movement of the head. So yun yung ginagawa dito for the dens or odontoid process. Now, in terms of the spinous process, meron din naman si axis. It usually projects dorsally. So makikita nyo naman it towards the back. So ang pinaka-function naman nito, ganun din for rotational movement of the head. So very crucial ito sa ability ng animals natin to turn their heads from side to side, which is very important for activities nila. Like for example, yung grazing, for their surveillance for any possible predators, and their interaction with the environment. Now we have another one, which is the thoracic vertebrae, which is being found in the thoracic region of the vertebral column in the animal. So nakikita natin to, of course, in the chest area of the vertebral column. So between the cervical vertebrae, or which is the neck region, and the lumbar vertebrae, which is on the lower back region. So na-i-present ko naman na kanina kung ano yung mga samples ng numbers of the thoracic vertebrae in the animals. So it usually vary among species of the animals natin. Okay, meron tayong tinatawag dito na transverse fovea. So it usually the transverse costal fovea or transverse costal facet. So ano sila, specialized na surfaces sila. So ang pinaka-function lang ng mga to is for their articulation with ribs. So yung transverse costal fovea or the transverse fovea, they are being found on the transverse processes of the thoracic vertebrae. So etong facet na to, this is where the head of a rib usually articulates. So the head of the rib has a corresponding articular surface that fits into the transverse costal fovea. So when the rib articulates with the transverse costal fovea, it allows for various movements. Like for example, during respiration, yung ribs can move up and down. Okay? So merong increasing and decreasing the volume of the thoracic cavity. So this is essential for breathing and yung function ng lungs natin. Okay? So that is one example or one function of the transverse fovea. Now, meron din tayong tinatawag na coastal fovea. Ito naman is usually ganun din. It is designed to articulate with the heads of the ribs, forming etong costovertebral joint. So in terms of rib articulation, yung coastal fovea, shallow lang sila. Okay? They are usually shallow shallow na concave depressions that are being found on the lateral sides of the vertebral bodies of thoracic vertebrae. Okay? So parang each coastal fovea is associated with a specific rib. So etong mga costovertebral joints, the articulation between the head of a rib and the costal fovea of the corresponding thoracic vertebra forms a synovial joint known as the costovertebral joint. So etong mga joints na to, they are being crucial doon sa biomechanics ng rib cage. So DJ articulation, basta pag sinabi natin na biomechanics, it's usually under articulation, okay, yung mga rib movement. So like for example, during inhalation, yung ribs ng animals natin, they move upward and outward. So expanding now the thoracic cavity and allowing the lungs to fill with the oxygen. So kumbaga during exhalation naman, yung mga ribs will return to their resting position. So that is the function of the costal fovea. So we can connect this one later on sa respiratory system. Okay, then we have the lumbar vertebrae, which is on the lower back or on the loin region. So ito naman is more on tawag nito, yung mga processes. We have the transverse, the accessory, and then we have the mammillary processes. So in terms of number, ganun din, they vary between or they vary among the species of the animals. So ang pinaka-function lang nito in terms of the lumbar vertebrae is for supporting the weight of the body and transmitting it to the pelvis and lower limbs. So they usually provide the stability and strength to the vertebral column. So we have here the transverse processes. We have the transverse processes here. They are bony projections that extend laterally from the vertebral arc of each lumbar vertebrae. So nag-serve sila as attachment points for muscles. So for muscles, for ligaments, for tendons, that usually has a role sa pag-stabilize ng vertebral column and controlling the movement. Now, in terms of accessory process, ito naman is more on additional lang sila. Kung makikita nyo, maliliit lang to. They are additional bony projections that are being found on some lumbar vertebrae. So they are often located on the caudal or inferior aspect of the transverse processes. So ang pinaka-precise na function lang ng mga to is they are being served as additional site or additional attachment site for muscles, or they provide stability to the vertebral column. So in terms of the mammillary processes naman, dorsal back aspect of the lumbar vertebrae naman to. So ang pinaka-function lang nila is ganun din. It's more an attachment point for the ligaments. And then we have the sacral vertebrae, which is under the pelvis region. So kung makikita ninyo, there are different views. So we have lateral, dorsal, and then the ventral. So meron tayong tinatawag na median sacral crest. So bony ridge din running along the dorsal surface of the sacrum. So it is formed by the fusion of the spinous processes of the individual sacral vertebrae. And then we have the wing, or what we call as the alley. So they are usually broad na flat lateral expansions on each side of the sacrum. So they usually project laterally from the body of the sacrum. So ang ginagawa nila dito is they articulate with the wings of the sacrum to form the sacroiliac joint. Yung mga ilium natin, which is one of the three bones of the pelvis. Then we have the dorsal sacral or dorsal sacral foramina and then the ventral sacral foramina. So they are usually small lang din naman, small na opening holes located on the dorsal surface of the sacrum. So usually etong mga to, they are remnants already. They are remnants of the intervertebral foramina or the intervertebral foramen that existed between the individual na sacral vertebrae before merong tinatawag natin na fusion. So etong mga foramina, like for the other foramina kanina, they usually provide passageways for the nerve and blood cells natin. And then meron din tayong tinatawag na promontory, which is the sacral promontory. So ano din to, it's usually found on the ventral surface of the sacrum. So ang pinaka-important lang naman dito is during parturition. Okay, during parturition ng animals natin, like for example in animals natin, especially in species with eto, yung sacral promontory, it usually serves as an obstetric na landmark. So it marks the beginning of the pelvic inlet, which is the passage through which the newborn animal must pass during delivery. Okay, the pelvic inlet. Inlet as in INLET. Okay, so etong shape tsaka yung orientation ng sacral promontory, it usually vary among the species. So it reflect now the adaptation for the specific requirement of the parturition in each species. Okay, then we have the caudal vertebrae. This is now known as the tail vertebrae, which is being found on the tail region of the vertebral column in animals natin. So, ano lang naman ang pinaka function lang naman ng caudal vertebrae is for articulation between or between yung caudal na articular process and then yung which is usually allow yung flexibility and coordination in tail movement. So meaning to say yung caudal vertebrae, it's more on tail movement and balance. So meron tayo dito yung caudal articular process and then the cranial articular process or what we call as zygapophyses. Okay? So eto naman, it's usually they are being paired na structure on the cranial and caudal posterior aspect of each caudal vertebrae. So for the vertebral arc, also known as the neural arc, Neural, okay, neural arc, it usually encloses and protects the spinal cord. So kung makikita ninyo sa first part noon, meron din sila etong vertebral arc doon sa vertebral arc din sa una kanina. It usually consists yung pedicles, yung laminate, saka yung mga spinous processes. Okay? Then for the transverse processes, ganun lang din, point of attachment, but then it is usually on the involvement of the tail movement and stability na. And then for the body or the vertebral body or centrum, ganun lang din, same lang na function, but then as what I have said, it usually provides now the support and it distribute the forces along the length of the tail of the animal na. And then we have the last one, we have the hemal arc. Ito naman is typically from the mid to caudal region of the tail. So it may enclose or partially enclose the caudal artery and vein which usually run along the underside of the tail na. Okay? But then as well, ang take note lang that for the hemal arc, it is usually not present in all caudal vertebrae. So as an end of my presentation, so we have the different regions, no, of the vertebral column or the vertebrae. We have the cervical, which is on the chest region. We have the thoracic, And then we have the lumbar, we have the sacral, and then we have the caudal. So I hope that you have understood well the vertebral column of the animals.